So welcome everybody to our uh, now third local lens. Really excited. We are talking about Title 21 and site access. Um, Before we get started, I just want to review our group agreements. If you've done this before, you're probably familiar. But our local lens are a space for learning and conversation among members of community councils and the public. The goal of the sessions is to dive deep into various governmental structures within the municipality. By joining, we agree to treat each other with respect, recognize our neighborhood's unique qualities, allow everyone a chance to participate, and some Zoom logistics. Please stay muted unless you're called on to ask a question. It'd be great if you can message questions in the chat, especially if you're not interested in asking your question. You want the facilitator to just ask. Remember to stay on topic. The question should be relevant to the topic of the session. Be concise and be considerate of time. And with that, I will introduce our speakers. We've got a lovely panel today. I'm super excited, starting with Assemblymember Volland. We also have Devin Kelly, a senior planner with the Cook Inlet Housing Authority. We have John Thurber, president for South Addition Community Council. We have Mélisa Babb, director of the Municipal Planning Department, and Daniel McKenna Foster, long range planner for the municipality. Uh, the floor is yours.
Okay, I think I'm starting us off, right, Holly? Here we go. Um, so awesome. Site access. Yes, our goal is to reform Title 21 to remove barriers to housing development and improve safety and access for all users. But there's also some other goals woven into this legislation, which is to help make our community more walkable. So here we have some snippets from Mayor LaFrance's plan, 10,000 homes in 10 years. I won't read directly from the slide, but I'll just say that the Parking and Site Access Code Rewrite Project was originally initiated by the Planning Department to address problematic development patterns from the 1960s through the 80s, which were car-centric and in many places eliminated the pedestrian environment. However, while these changes were intended to transition Anchorage into a more walkable community, and that is still a goal of ours as a working group, they ultimately resulted in increased barriers to housing development. So we're trying to strike a balance. We know that the Anchorage Bowl is land constrained, meaning that an important way to provide more housing is to, where appropriate, increase housing density through infill and multifamily dwellings. And another interesting thing is that about 60% of the multifamily units are actually townhouses with garages. So not the type of apartment buildings that we think of when we talk about multifamily. Next slide. Okay, so what is site access? Um, Essentially, it's how pedestrians and vehicles get to and from a site and move around on a site safely. So considerations of private property, rights of way, and then also public right of way, and how those things interface together. How does our shared environment work? I think we'll go to the next slide. Great. So here's what we are trying to avoid and what the original site access AO was trying to prevent. Essentially, looking at this blank wall, large paved surface, in addition to not being the most aesthetic environment, there's also a real safety concern, unrestricted flow of traffic between private property and the public street. Next slide. And here is what the site access that original AO was trying to encourage. We wanted more controlled vehicular access on and off site, better building frontages connected to the public streetscape. You can see those covered primary entrances, also the eyes on the street, those windows that look out to the street and interact with the pedestrian environment. clear, walkable, safe paths from the public right of way to the front entrance, so people know what the front entrance is. And then also look at that sidewalk, how it's level and at grade. I think that's important as well. And we've had a lot of conversation in our working group about sidewalks. Next slide. So one thing that the assembly did is we took that portion pertaining to site access and we expanded it to other neighborhoods beyond what the planning department originally intended. We did hear from the development community that it actually ended up making it harder to build housing that we need in Anchorage. It created some unintended consequences and some barriers. And so the idea of this working group has been to fix that and to right size our code, but also to strike a balance of how do we protect the environment of our neighborhoods in that pedestrian safety, et cetera, while also recognizing the need for 10,000 units in 10 years. And so I think with that, I will kick it over to Devin.
Thanks, Member Volland. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Devin, and I work on housing initiatives at Cook Inlet Housing Authority. So building on what Member Volland was just saying, there were good intentions behind the original site access, but it really did kind of break the code for housing. And by that, I mean, it made it so most Cook Inlet Housing Authority projects could not be built today. And these are developments that we think are good for Anchorage and implement our comprehensive plan goals. So on this slide, showing a few examples of CHA projects that you may recognize. These were built on lots that were previously vacant and underutilized. They now provide housing for 187 households, or about 300 of your neighbors in Anchorage. And every one of these fails to meet the rules of AO 2023-50. And that is primarily because of the amount of parking directly in front of each building. So if you go to the next slide, AO 2023-50 really went beyond issues of safety and functionality to more of like the area of the visual impact of parking in garages, even when buffered from a public street by trees and landscaping. So areas designated as urban on a map had the biggest restrictions. This is where as much as 50% of the space between the building and the public street at any point could not be parking. And so you can see how that rule does not work with any of these designs. And there are reasons that each of these buildings were built in the way that they were. We're accounting for site topography like slopes, the noise and condition of the nearby roads, snow removal needs, funding availability, and surrounding streets that really don't have on-street parking or anywhere for cars to go. And these buildings and developments really added much needed housing units to our affordable housing stock while also supporting livability for residents who in many cases do rely on cars. So if you go to the next slide, I want to tell you a tale of two projects that show why site access is easy in a few places in Anchorage and very challenging in most parts of Anchorage, especially when it comes to small infill projects. So this is a CHA duplex that was built in 2015 on Wilshire Street in Central Spenard. It has small garages, which are really useful for people, and there's no alley, and there's no real easy way to put parking behind the building. And there's also really no room to park on the street. As you can see, I was taking this picture and practically blocking the road because of how narrow it is on the street beyond where the driveway ends. And these are 3-bedroom apartments. Each duplex has 3 bedrooms, and the household may very easily have 2 cars. And so as a result, the parking is in front, and it definitely does not meet that 50% rule in AO 2023-50. But if you go to the next slide, up on Cordova and East 12th Avenue and South Addition, there is an alley right there. And what I want to tell you is this: if there is a usable alley, site access is easy. Cook Inlet Housing built these 2 triplexes in 2017. These buildings actually have pretty much the same amount of parking as that Wilshire Street duplex. It's just that the parking is on the alley, as you can see in the picture on the right. That's behind the building. And then on East 12th Avenue, we kind of have this like lovely urban design, Portlandish, design. We all like that. I like it. We all like it. It's nice. And CHA will continue to build this type of project in South Addition and other places with improved alleys. We have done this in other places and will continue to. But the reality is, and you'll hear about this momentarily, is that about 90% of Anchorage does not have alleys. And many places have no on-street parking, and at least not year-round through the winter. And there's also just really not a lot of public sidewalks, even on East 12th Avenue, when we're talking about pedestrian environments. So if Cook Inlet were to change the Wilshire Street duplex or to change the designs of those larger projects we looked at earlier to meet the original AO 2023-50, that would mean less density, smaller buildings, and really fewer places for people to live. And that also affects whether it even makes financial sense to build the project in the first place. Like, all of these things have an impact. So these are policy decisions that we're making, and just want people to consider that. And at the end of the day, after 2023-50 passed, most of C-House projects and a lot of other housing became non-conforming. That is, could not be permitted as is. So I think if we go to the next slide, this is my last piece. So I think there's actually a lot we can learn here for the future. So first, this change that we've been talking about really didn't receive sufficient testing or modeling with actual sites before it took effect. And second, it was part of a nearly 70-page ordinance, much of which is displayed on the screen here, that was very confusing to read. My colleagues and I, builders, didn't understand the front parking change until after 2023-50 passed, if we're being honest. And if you're in the audience here feeling confused by the code and like you're having trouble keeping track of things, I just want to tell you, it's not just you. Even experts are having a lot of trouble with this. And if you and I can't understand or access the zoning code, we can't meaningfully participate in the planning process. That's my feeling. And so that is why there's a real need to simplify the code into plain English and create better process around making and communicating changes. And I think with that, it's a good place to turn it over to Daniel with MOA planning. Or wait, maybe John Thurber actually, but whoever's next.
John Thurber.
Great.
Well, good evening, everyone. I was very fortunate to be invited to participate in the working group committee. And this was a joint effort of the Assembly and the Mayor's office. And it's very encouraging to see that type of collaboration. And successful planning, I think, really needs collaboration, and including the neighborhoods is very much appreciated. Like Devin was saying, the code is complicated. It's hard for average people like me, who are not engineers, who are not architects, who are not planners, to really understand what the code is trying to say. And the ability to try and demonstrate what the code is showing us through illustrations or photographs or site visits, I think is really helpful in raising awareness, raising the educational portion of it, which is important to get buy-in, I think, from a lot of our communities. And I also want to say that the local lens is also really helpful in engaging our communities and raising awareness. And I'm very appreciative of what the Federation of Community Councils is doing. We all want vibrant neighborhoods. We all want a thriving city. And so this kind of outreach, this kind of collaboration is very encouraging. And I hope we can continue this type of process going forward. Next person.
We'll let you introduce the next section, Mélisa.
Oh, is this for me? Okay, great. Thanks, Holly. So I'm Mélisa Babb. I'm the planning director for the municipality, and we were very excited about this collaborative process with the assembly and the community councils and some local developers. The working group was fantastic. And the mayor's office has identified site access specifically as a key piece of code to update and address the most recent change, because site access did exist in code prior to the most recent change, but this most recent change is the piece that we're hoping to address with these proposed solutions. So I am going to pass it off to Daniel McKenna Foster, who will go over the proposed changes to the site access code.
Thank you, Mélisa, and thank you, everyone. And I'll just say before getting, this is a really complicated topic. You think, oh, it's just streets and sidewalks, but there's a lot to it. So thank you in advance. I think the main thing is just defining the problem. What problem are we trying to solve here? And it's really about the interaction between private properties in the street and the definition of what's public street and what's private property and how people get from one to the other. So, all over Anchorage, we have a lot of vehicle-centered frontages where the entire frontage is just for driving. And that sort of makes the street space, driving space, dangerous space blend in all over the place. And you have pretty much uncontrolled vehicular access. So somebody can drive it off and on their lot. And if you're a user in the street, maybe you have limited mobility, you're a kid, or maybe you're an uncertain driver. This makes a situation where you just have potential contact points all over the place. And this really creates a real safety problem. And if you're, a pedestrian or rolling or however you get around, you also just don't know, where do I belong? Where can I move through this space? And it creates a lot of issues. Next slide, please. So this is sort of the ideal. And I think when many of us think of the neighborhoods that we love or the places we like to be, it's something like this. And this is a fantastic spot. In terms of infrastructure, though, this is a really expensive and really sort of difficult to reproduce type of built environment. You have a nice street, you have a curb, you have a little planter strip in between, and you have a full nice sidewalk. So you have great access for people walking from their houses onto the sidewalk. You have full walking infrastructure, full driving infrastructure, all that nice curb space that's protecting people, gives you parking space, gives you snow storage. This is absolutely fantastic. But this, unfortunately, is not what most of Anchorage looks like. Because if you look at it, another thing about that picture is that's accessed off an alley. Yeah, thank you, Holly. So that's why you're able to do this, because many people still drive. They want to be able to drive their cars. They need to get from their house to the driving system, the car system, the road system. And unfortunately, that only works when there are alleys. So this is a map that are all the alleys in Anchorage that we know of. And the blue ones are the paved ones. So all the red ones are the unpaved ones. So Anchorage has some alleys, about 12% of Anchorage has alleys, but I bet maybe half of that are paved, right? So this is kind of an issue that we all love those neighborhoods where you have this really nice frontage, it's safe, it's walkable, and you can get to the things you need by driving into the alley and off. But unfortunately, a lot of Anchorage is not like that. And a lot of Anchorage is built out in a way that it's really hard to retrofit that, to go back in time and sort of create and establish those alleys. So if you look at the built pattern, the fabric of Anchorage today, most of it doesn't have alleys. And that's really what we're dealing with. So we're dealing with the ideal of these neighborhoods we'd all love to see and we love to be in, with the actuality, the practicalities of 50 years of building in Anchorage, which didn't do that. Next slide, please. So this is the reality that a lot of Anchorage was built over decades and decades and decades to focus on the car, to focus on car access. And it's pretty hard to change that. You can't just change that overnight. And you really can't change that just by focusing on private property on a case-by-case basis. Because the pace of change in Anchorage is slow. So this is West 12th Avenue. And, this is an area where people have seen a lot of change. But just if you look at the aerial photos, even in a place like this, the change is not that great, actually, when it comes down to it. So here, the image on the top is about 2012 or 2014. The image on the bottom is the same street in 2024. And you see there are two new houses, one house off the back and another house toward the back of the lot. So even if we say this is the most extreme change a street might see in Anchorage, it's two new houses in 10 years. So if you have that built environment where you have everything with all those big garage or those parking lot frontages, we just can't really expect that things are going to change that fast. And so part of this project was realizing that if we want to make these changes, we might not be able to affect them through zoning code, and we're probably not going to be able to affect them through site access specifically. Next slide, please. So back to alleys. One thing that we absolutely made certain of, and this was something we heard and something everybody agreed on, is that when there is an alley, we want people to take advantage of it. Alley infrastructure is like golden infrastructure for cities. We should make sure that people make the most of them. So the new standards say you have to take alley access if there's an alley. There's some situations, say the alley's undeveloped, undevelopable. Maybe it's really steep. Maybe it's simply not possible. But in almost every case, we really push people to take advantage of those alleys and take access off of that. So that was a really big piece and something everybody definitely agreed on. Next slide, please. The other thing we looked at is driveway width and those big sort of uncontrolled frontages, right? And what we ended up with is constraining those and limiting the width of the driveway, but also making sure that people can't sneak over that extra area, right? And say, oh yeah, I only have a 28-foot driveway, but this is just a brick paver. I'm not going to drive over it. So one really interesting thing about this code is it actually creates a new set of perimeter landscaping requirements for driving areas or driving facilities. So everybody gets a 28-foot driveway, but if you have drivable space behind that and grass isn't drivable, then you have to have some sort of vertical separation. It could be trees, bushes, or it could be full landscaping bed. It could be a rock. And the purpose of that is sort of to bring back a little bit of that street space that could be used for parking a car on the street or storing snow on the street. And so we're trying to move away from these big uncontrolled frontages where people can be moving from street to private property, off and on everywhere, to a more constrained, limited area. And as you see in the pictures below, that you could have 28 feet in all one driveway, or you could have two 12s or two 14s. You get that allowance, but the intent here really is that we want to be able to control some of the street and preserve some of the street to not have that unconstrained access. Next slide, please. Here's another great example. This is a house actually right near where I live. And if you've ever seen it, the house is basically an island of asphalt, which makes sense, right? If you own this house, you're like, I don't want to have to mow the lawn. I don't want to have to go plow on the grass or not. It's easy to make this decision. Unfortunately, it makes things difficult for the public realm. And so here you have basically no differentiation between what the private property is and the public property. What this site access would do, if this was built today, would say you cannot have this sort of unbroken driveway, which everything is driveway. You have to have separation. So again, that could be the landscaping bed. It could be trees, shrubs, rocks, bollards, anything like that. So the left is what kind of has been done in the past, and the right is what we would be moving towards in the future. Next slide, please. Another thing we heard a lot about is, connecting from where people get out of their cars or where they walk from the street to the house. So you always have to have a connection from the street to the front door. You always have to have covering over the front door. We also did get into some of the window standard stuff. You have to have a certain percentage of windows on the front of your building. Initially, we had a lower standard. We heard from the working group. We went to a higher standard on that and on both primary and secondary frontages. But you're always supposed to have a clear walkway between the public right-of-way and the building so somebody walking can get to that spot. Next slide, please. And another piece that really came through in the working group is we're trying to get to pedestrian safety. We're trying to get to different kind of transportation outcomes. And a lot of that might mean we have to focus on the street instead of on private property. And we're doing a lot of that right now. So we're updating the design criteria manual, which is how the streets are designed. That means there's more flexibility to build narrower streets, slower streets, more Wooner type streets. The AMATS is doing their complete streets project right now. The long-range transportation strategy done by the municipality is looking at long-term policy objectives and strategies for meeting community needs, and more active management of the right-of-way. So that means controlling how people use the right-of-way, controlling how they leave their vehicles in the right-of-way, controlling how people operate vehicles or walk or roll or however they get through the right-of-way. Next slide, please. And that's all for me. Thank you, Holly.
Okay, before I talk about next steps, Anna Brawley has one thing she would like to say. She was also an assembly member on the working group.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me okay. Yeah, I think what Holly is getting to is the next steps. Or was there another item that you want me to talk about? Okay, thanks, sorry. Obviously we planned this well in advance. So just want to let you know, we are giving information today and especially an opportunity to ask questions. And I know we're leaving plenty of time for that, so I'll leave it to the experts in the room to speak to that, but just want to emphasize the next step in this process is that it's going to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So there's a public hearing on Monday, March 3rd. So actually a week from today. So March is coming up. So there's an opportunity to send your comments. There'll be a public hearing. And then also there was a work session that happened on Friday that I believe you can watch the recording of to get more detail and understand some of the questions that have come up. And then so here you can see that you can, as I said, attend in person, give your testimony, or below you can see the ways to call or submit your written comments. So again, we just want to emphasize this is moving through the process. Eventually it will go back on, or it will go to an assembly meeting in the future, but really the next step is with planning and zoning. And I know there'll be a lot of good discussion there. So I think that's all I need to share. Thank you.
Someone will be putting all of this information into the chat, so will be easily clickable for you to get to this information. We'll also put everybody's contact information in the chat so you can continue to reach out to people after this meeting. But with that, I'll pass it back to Ari to maybe start a Q&A.
That was great. Thank you guys so much. And as a reminder, you can drop questions in the chat or raise your hand if you have any, but we have one from Dwayne. Is there any analysis to show how many potential residential development site exist in Anchorage to enable the mayor's housing goals?
Which team member would like to tackle this answer?
Daniel McKenna Foster, do you feel up for tackling that one as long range?
Yeah, this is Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning. That's I'm not going to give you a very precise answer, but how many potential residential development sites exist to enable the mayor's housing goal? It really depends on, what types of units they might be. In terms of if you're looking at how many units are vacant or how many properties are vacant that could be built, how many units or how many existing properties are maybe old and might be rehabbed or added a unit onto, or, how many sites are there to do larger scale? I don't think there's been a full analysis to do everything like that specifically. There's been a lot of little analyses to look at how smaller types of reforms could do that. But it really, Anchorage has seen a lot of reforms over the past few years that have expanded the capacity of a lot of different lots. But right now, the planning department is really trying to look at, well, how do we encourage people to make the most of those lots that exist now? Could it be, adding an accessory dwelling unit or something like that? So it's, I don't have a great answer for you, because it could be that a lot of these new units could go on existing in infill. Some of it might be new builds. I think a lot of it is figuring out what's the easiest way to get that done, and which way will the various, and it's not just market forces, because, working with CHA as well, but looking at where can we get those and what are the things we can do to make that happen.
Thank you. And this one might also be a planning question. Mike Edgington says, thank you, presenters. These changes are mostly justified in terms of Anchorage 2040 goals, but some of them also affect the northern and southern communities outside of Anchorage Bowl and outside of the scope of Anchorage 2040. Will there be any analysis done of the muni-wide impacts? Oh, yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Mike. So yeah, the site access was focused mostly on the bowl. It was focused on 2107 and a few other areas. There are a couple areas that might apply to Eagle River and Girdwood, just because those sections reference the bowl code. But the building frontage standards do not apply, because it says explicitly that development in Girdwood, Chugach, Eagle River, downtown, and a few other districts, it does not apply. But Mike, I would recommend look at the sections. It's section 8 in the AO. That's 2107-090. That's the sort of parking areas section. That would apply based on my reading of the Girdwood code that says 2109-070 references 2107-090. And maybe some of the stuff with private streets. But I think a lot of the Girdwood street standards happen to be your own when sidewalks are required or not. So generally, it's intended to be working, focusing on the bowl and development in the bowl. And in the areas where it was clear we were focusing on not Girdwood, not Chugach Eagle River.
Thanks. I have a question for you guys. Can you talk a bit about what the process for the working group was? Kind of what steps were taken? Who did you hear from? How did that kind of break out? How were people chosen for the working group?
Anna or Daniel, Daniel Volland, would you like to respond to this, or do you want me to jump in on this?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. I think probably Anna, but and maybe Mélisa could speak to it too. But I guess one of my goals was to get some community council member representation in this conversation. And I know that, so before I was elected to the assembly and I was active with my community council South Edition, John Thurber and I were both part of a smaller working group with another of our neighbors, Tamash, on the original site access. And so we had had the conversations around, protecting that alleyway access requirement, the windows on the primary frontages, et cetera. And I think Anna had some folks from her part of the community too. who she wanted to bring in as folks who follow these issues very closely. John Isaacs, for instance, was part of our working group. But yeah, I'll let maybe Anna take a crack at the question as well.
Yeah, just briefly, I think there's many projects that we work on that are looking ahead and say, what new policy can we introduce? I think the story with this one was really how do we undo something that isn't working, and something that did go through an extensive amount of process, but didn't really result in a product that was workable. And basically there were multiple points in this story, multiple ordinances to try to fix it, and then ultimately we said let's pause it and figure out how we can make it better. And so the goal with the working group is really not to retread the same ground, but to kind of step back and really talk through what is practical to put in code, and to the point about cost and the things that Devin shared about feasibility of projects, but also making sure that we are protecting community walkability and all of the things that neighborhoods want. And so it seemed like the most productive way to do that was to really bring everybody together. And you can see in that photo there a wide variety of people. We have muni staff, we have community members, we have mayor's office, assembly, developers, all walking together and really looking at these things in real life. And so the goal for me was really to, regardless of what the right answer is, to move through and figure out, what works for everybody. And so everybody kind of understands what these codes are trying to do. And so that way we have better code going forward. So that was my goal.
Awesome. Thank you.
Ariana, can I contribute to something?
Please do.
So that question about the development capacity or how much vacant land we have I think is a very interesting an important thing to understand. We're tracking that in South Addition ourselves. We have 42 vacant parcels in South Addition that total 556,055 square feet. It's 12.75 acres. So we have a lot of vacant parcels, but understanding what that development capacity is quite complicated. And we're trying to get some help on that. But if we divided the larger lots up into 6,000 square foot lots, we have the equivalent of 78 6,000 square foot lots within our South Addition neighborhood boundary. So there is a significant amount of capacity for additional housing, but we don't really know what the maximum amount of housing is on each one of those lots. And that's going to take some further analysis, and we're getting some help on that. But we are tracking the number of vacant lots available.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Appreciate that. I know you're being very thorough in South Addition. John Isaacs just commented, I appreciate the opportunity to serve on the Working Council representing Turnagain Community Council. I encourage the FCC and the Muni to continue this collaborative approach and engage more community councils. I have a couple more questions, but I just want to make sure, is there anybody in the group who has more questions or anything they want to add? Great. Site access. It's complicated stuff. I know when you guys were talking about it's parking, but it's also sidewalks, but it's also frontage design. I did have a question. Residential design standards were paused for 3 years. How does this interact with that pause?
I think a planner should take this one. Either that or an assembly person. Want to go for it, Daniel?
Yeah, I'm glad to. So the site access stuff the working group started last year, and the moratorium got introduced after that, and then the moratorium was passed. I think the moratorium, as it was finally adopted, did include a moratorium on the site access provisions. But we've kind of kept going through because not knowing what will happen with the moratorium could be removed any day. And we put in a lot of work on this, and we wanted to sort of respect all the work that went into it. And we think we've also addressed some of the problems that had existed even before. So right now, the moratorium covers a lot of what site access was also addressing. And when site access gets to the assembly members will have to make the policy choice about how they want to work out the effective date or how they want the different pieces to interact. But it was sort of that this train was moving and then this other train sort of surpassed it. But this train will keep going because it's replacing pieces of the code that needed to be replaced no matter what. With that, I'll leave it to Assembly members Brawley or Volland if they want to add to that.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And I actually don't know, and I haven't discussed that much. And I actually don't know if we have share the same perspective or not on that. My own personal perspective is that because we've gone through this working group process, and because these are things that have been important to the community for some time, I would like these changes to go into effect sooner than later, and potentially go into effect even during the timing of other things, other design standards being paused. But that's just my 2 cents, and I'm only one member of a 12-member assembly body.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just add that that's accurate with Daniel. And this ordinance is really only about halfway through its process. You know, it still needs to go to planning and zoning. And so I think that's also a question that I would love planning and zoning commission to take up. And if folks have thoughts about that, both from developers and community members, because you know, as we know, when ordinances move through the process, the intent is so that they can change or they can be responsive to what we need. And so I think that is an active question. And yeah, I think we've got a few more steps that we can take care of that. But I would also agree that if the rules work and they wouldn't trip people up, then I could see why we would put them back into place. It's just a matter of certainty. And like Devin said, when the code changes, it can be hard to track. So I think those are really the two considerations to think about. Thanks.
Thanks, both of you. I'm interested to see where it goes. Anna brought this up, and this was also one of my questions is, Daniel, you had mentioned that you said there was going to be that 2 buildings being built in 10 years was significant change for a street. So is there any recommendations coming out of this working group for how the assembly or the administration might incentivize changes to existing homes? Because I'm not tearing my house down anytime soon, but I may want to shorten my driveway or something. Well, is there anything that can be done? Anything that the group suggested?
Is that a question for Assemblymember Volland or for this Daniel?
I think it's just for the working group. So anybody can speak of like what you guys learned out of that and maybe what the thought was.
I think to me, the importance of this slide is just to show that the pace of change in Anchorage is pretty slow. So even if there's a pretty significant zoning change, because it just takes time, you know, I don't think most people are just going to go out tomorrow, no matter what happens, and immediately change their property. But at least what I've seen, I've been a planner for over 10 years at this point, is that it allows some incremental steps. It allows to let people make a slightly different decision than they would have made. And again, I don't know specifically to projects. I'd lean on Devin or Tyler Robinson on that, how this will affect the projects they specifically have. But my intent in showing this slide was that even in the areas of the most attractive power, the most interest in development, the pace of change is usually not that great. So, because it is for most people, you know, it's expensive to build a new house or put an addition on your house. And so people are usually kind of build incrementally. So from my perspective as a planner, I think site access might allow people to try something that they wouldn't have tried before. But I think at least what we've heard from, you know, feedback from people who are trying to build larger projects is this will make it easier. You know, there's still a number of obstacles, but this is removing several of those obstacles so they can fewer things to get around. But I think on that, I'd really defer to anybody who's actually building something.
Yeah, is there any focus though on existing structures, not new builds, anything that the working group recommended to advise on changes that could be made on homeowners today, or so that we can see change in sooner than 10 years approximately?
That's sorry, I didn't answer your question the first time. I think that the planning department is also having bigger discussions about non-conforming structures and how to make it easier for people to redevelop what they have. That's sort of a separate conversation. I think a lot of this code proposal doesn't change the existing rules that say when you change your house significantly, now you have to come into compliance with a new set of rules. So I think it's maybe too hard to say. And the working group and the code proposal didn't speak specifically to people making small changes. And a lot of these changes too, you know, it might be like somebody putting in a driveway. And so now they might put in a smaller driveway. That is something we could measure. But I guess that's actually a good recommendation. Maybe it is something we should be looking at tracking as we move forward.
Yeah. Daniel, it seemed like you might have an ad. Volland?
Well, this is tangentially related. I just saw John Isaacs, who was a member of our working group, his comment in the chat, and I think it's really a good one worth highlighting. The assembly, so when we removed parking minimums a few years ago, we did fund, and I was a co-sponsor of this budget amendment to do a study on right-of-way management, parking management, and best practices in snow removal. And so those studies are currently ongoing, and I'm hoping we'll get some really good takeaways because that's part of our public right-of-way too. Are those, the winter implications that we have? We can have sidewalks, but if the sidewalks are full of snow and ice, well, they're often not usable. And then, as was mentioned at the top of this presentation, more active right-of-way management, code enforcement, et cetera. And then if I really dream big on the parking management portion, I'm looking at what other jurisdictions are doing, and I think parking benefit districts are really interesting. And that was something, if I remember correctly, in the original ordinance where some of the parking reductions and site access were tied together. We ended up breaking that apart. There was some language in there about parking benefit districts. And so what that is if you have residential permitted parking, where it's like 2 hours only, unless you have a special tag because you're a resident of that area. What some jurisdictions will do is when citations are issued, when people violate those parking rules, the funds collected from the citations will go directly back to that hyper-local neighborhood to their benefit. So they can use that money to upgrade their neighborhood in various ways. That could look like putting in a speed bump, a traffic calming measure that the neighborhood wants. There's in California, there was one neighborhood that used their parking benefit district to buy Wi-Fi for the whole block. So I think that there's ways that we can really get creative with that public right of way.
Awesome. Thank you. About the actually, does anybody have any questions? There were a couple of comments. Oh, Dwayne had another question. And Dwayne, you may need to clarify this. Are there any significant NIMBY considerations in the proposed alternatives? Not in my backyard, NIMBY.
Well, I was just thinking, are there any elements of this that neighbors or neighborhoods might dislike because for whatever reason they would perceive it not to be in their interest?
I'd be happy to take that. So I don't like to use the term NIMBY. I refer to my change averse neighbors. People are invested in their neighborhoods, and they don't want to see rapid change to the detriment of the shared environment. And I think that's important. And I think this work is targeted at protecting some of the things that people really enjoy about their neighborhoods. Again, the windows on the front of the building, so you're not just looking at a blank wall. The not having wide driveway cuts on the primary street if there's an alleyway, which is to the detriment of pedestrians or kids who are playing in the neighborhood, right? That car-centric public safety issue that we've discussed here tonight. When the assembly amended, so I didn't move the amendment. Kevin Cross, who's no longer on the assembly, he brought it forward, but I did support it at the time. Because my thought was, we've done a lot of work on this, and these are the things that are important to my neighbors: at-grade sidewalks and alleyway access requirements. And I think the goal of the assembly at the time was to take those things further than just certain neighborhoods, because those would be things that other neighborhoods would enjoy. We got tangled up a little bit in some of the unforeseen consequences that have been discussed here tonight. But I think really that is what we're trying to solve: is how do we not get in the way unnecessarily of new housing? I know, Dwayne, you've been working hard on that project for potential multifamily housing at St. Mary's, and I think that's really awesome and exciting. But also, how do we protect that shared environment and enjoy the things that people like about their neighborhoods? How do we protect that?
Thank you.
And if I could just add really briefly too, I think another thing to understand, it's not specifically in response to that question, but it kind of gives context for why we're working on this project. like I mentioned, there's a lot of things you can do with zoning code to change the policy. What we're trying to do is fix a problem that already exists in the code. So really, right now, this section of code is paused. And so it doesn't mean that there's no, and I want to separate from the design standards pause. This has been paused since April of last year because we heard from too many people that it's not working. And it wasn't just working for housing projects, it was not working for commercial. And that's even with kind of returning it to that smaller geographic area. So really the underlying code is the problem. And so it's paused right now with the idea that we work through this process as quickly as we can. And again, I don't know exactly what the right answer is. I don't know exactly what every letter of code that needs to go in there that is the best version of it. But if we don't do something, then we either need to continue pausing what's there or repeal it, because that's because basically it's I don't want to use too many extreme words, but it's a little bit like a time bomb in the code, that when it becomes unpaused, it will stop things from getting built. And so, again, that's why I want to emphasize where this project came from, because it is a really great opportunity to balance all of these different needs, but also what we have right now isn't working. And so it's trying to fix that, and why we're moving through this process.
Thank you. Were there any recommendations from the working group that did not get included as part of this AO?
I can probably speak to that a little bit, and then I might pass it off to somebody else. But we spent a lot of time in the working group discussing what belonged in Title 21 and what we might be able to address in other planning processes or other projects that were happening at the time. And so that list that we had up earlier that talked about the DCM and which is the Design Criteria Manual, and a few other things. I don't know, Holly, if you can bring that up again. Became what we called our parking lot of places where we might be able to address walkability and pedestrian safety and sidewalks and things like that, in a way that wouldn't require it to be codified. So the Design Criteria Manual is where our design standards for all of our muni roads live. And so that it's essential that addresses walkability, and that we have some flexibility in that manual to allow for all types of users in the right of way. And so we allowed some of those walkability pieces to maybe take up residence in the DCM rather than Title 21. We also talked about the official streets and highways plan, which is where our roads are classified by use, and that impacts other pieces of walkability and AMAT's complete streets and so on and so forth. So there were a lot of recommendations that the working group did make that will make their way into some of these other projects that we have listed here. So you will see several of these appear within the next year at PZC, and hopefully in more presentations like this as well.
Awesome.
If I could just pipe in real quick, one of the cool things too is that as part of this working group, we had folks from the transportation department and from AMATs. And so they had some great insights about these plans that are ongoing and what could be tweaked and changed. I know the mayor and our traffic engineer, Brad Coy, are really excited about the concept of neighborhood greenways. So we talked about, in neighborhoods where the context is not that they already have sidewalks, what efforts could be done to slow speeds on those streets and to have additional pavement markings and signage, letting people know that this is a shared environment. There's cars that come through here, but there's also kids who play in the street, or there's bicyclists, etc. And so that was included in the mayor's proposed budget, and I'm excited to see that effort be underway soon.
Thank you. I don't see any questions, but so the next step for this is that it goes before planning and zoning. Are you guys doing any additional engagement that people can keep their eyes out for, other than testifying at planning and zoning? Yeah, Daniel.
So we had a work session with planning and zoning last Friday, and those materials are posted on the site access project page. And we're having another work session with them immediately before the meeting on the 3rd. And so it'll be public. It's going to be at the library, but it's going to be in the Beluga room. But that's just to get any final questions and so people can see the process and how it goes down, and then they'll discuss it at the regular meeting as well. But until then, those are the only 2 other events we have.
And the public can't ask questions at work sessions for planning and zoning, correct? Like I know for the assembly they can't, but do you know if there's?
I don't think there is a public kind of testimony component at those work sessions, but it would be the kind of thing where attend the work session, see the discussion, and then come and give comment, and then they would be discuss. I would hope.
All right, can I add on to that one thing? So on the planning department's webpage for this specific case that will be at the Planning and Zoning Commission, there's a staff report there that you can review. However, this is like Devin's slideshow shows, this is a really complicated case. We're gonna pass along this presentation to you, Ari, and tomorrow morning we're also going to share a 1-page document that can be viewed as like a citizen's review guide to site access code. So we do have a 1-pager that can help people review like this 40-page document that is going to change this code. In addition, people are welcome to reach out to us if they have questions between now and the Planning and Zoning Commission hearing. We're going to share all that info, and if you get any feedback, we'll take any question that people have.
Thank you. And will anybody be willing to go to community councils if any members in the audience were interested in inviting somebody to speak on this at their council, give a presentation? Looks like McKenna Foster, maybe.
I'm glad to come and speak for hours about site access for anybody who's interested. With anybody else who wants to join me, of course.
And this is Anna. If I could just briefly add, yeah, I think it's an extremely technical ordinance. And so even our group putting these slides together was a whole process trying to translate the code and really the stuff underneath the code into helping understand it. So yeah, I think planning staff are really great for that. I will also note, as I said, this is trying to fix a part of code that's already there that went through over 2 years of process. So I just want to emphasize too, that we, considered all of the input that went into the original version. And what we're really trying to do is, I think, achieve basically the same goals, but with better code. And so just to say also, I know there's sometimes expectation that we go through, 6 months to a year of public engagement. And really that happened with the prior ordinance. And still we're in the place that we're in. And so I'm not suggesting that less process produces a better product, but I just want to also emphasize like what we're trying to do here and why. And so certainly we have some time, but also, as I said, it's going to be it's going to be unpaused very soon, and we need to fix it. So we want to make sure there's a runway to get that into code so that folks understand it, and we can see if there's any other unintended consequences before it messes somebody up the next time. Thanks.
I don't think there are any other questions from the group. I did see a few comments in the chat, but thank you all so much. Is there anything you guys wanted to end on, or any last comments?
Yeah, I'll just briefly say, oh, look, this is great. Peyton just put our contact information in the chat. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. You don't have to wait for the Planning and Zoning Commission, public hearing. You can always email your assembly members or email the contacts at the planning department for more information, and we'll be happy to try to get that out to you. Yeah, so now's the time to email us, and please don't feel like you have to be an expert in this stuff to tell us what is important to you about your neighborhood.